Now, streaming changed all of that, right? Where you didn't have to pay anything. And in fact, the per stream valuation of things, which works really well for Taylor Swift when you're expecting to get billions of plays on something, just does not work for music that is not intended to be listened to in the background all the time, right? Like there's a whole very important, I would argue, category of music that you're not supposed to listen to all the time. That's not its function, right? Like it's a art music, weird music, whatever. When the logic flipped to this per stream valuation, which is very much a value call, right? It was a value call by web to suggest that the thing that you listen to the most is the best or deserves the most money, right? Which is a value that is a value proposition that's worth intense scrutiny, I think.
Mixcloud.
The Inside Track.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the final episode of our very first inaugural season of The Inside Track. This is the podcast where we take you inside music and technology and talk to some interesting people and get their take on what's happening and where they came from, and hopefully learn a few things along the way. Today, I'm very, very excited to introduce our guest by the name of Mat Dryhurst. He is self-described, I believe, as an artist, technologist, maybe cultural critic. I think your Twitter bio also says builder. Am I right? Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the Twitter bio it's a German pun on builder being the German word for image.
Interesting.
No, it's a pun. Yeah, I shift the Twitter thing all the time. I guess. Yeah, in short, I'm an artist by my own. I guess other people have called me that now, so it's fine. But
it's official when other people call you it.
I guess. Yeah. I guess.
So we've known each other maybe a couple of years. I guessed it on your Interdependent podcast. I think it was in 2021, right in the pandemic, when live streaming was just this huge thing that everybody and their grandmother was live streaming. And we had a really interesting conversation then about music, copyright, lots of different things. But today I'd love to get into it and talk a little bit. We're going to talk about AI. We're going to talk about yourself and your partner, Holly Herndon, just wrapped up an exhibition at the Serpentine in London. We're going to talk about DAOs, governance, opt-in and opt-out, lots of different things we'll cover. But I thought maybe just to kind of give people a little bit of background and context on you, it'd be nice to kind of start towards the beginning, just to hear a little bit about, where you grew up and sort of what were your first sort of steps in music culture.
Yeah, happy to. So I grew up in Kuwait. So I was born in England in the 80s. And I think I was on a plane after like 5 days because I was a summer baby and both my parents are high school teachers. And so they got the summers off. And yeah, they were in Kuwait and my dad's still there. He's been there pushing 50 years or something. It's crazy. So I grew up in Kuwait. Start with music. I mean, basically my parents, both my parents have exceptional taste in music. I definitely have that you have to credit them on that. My dad's like a big kind of prog guy. My mom listens to a lot of reggae. They just basically always had like a lot of great music around the house. And I vividly remember, we're both new parents. I was trying to think back to how like my earliest memories. And I was like, God, I'm pretty sure I can remember being in a crib. And my one enduring memory is hearing music. Like, I can't quite piece it together, but basically it was always music playing in the house. My parents also used to host a lot. They would have parties often. And so basically, as a teenager, got into, I was initially just very into metal. We had like a music channel that would come on satellite TV called Channel V, which was Asia's MTV. And so you'd basically get syndicated music videos that I assume were playing at MTV at the time. There would be some kind of filtration and censorship probably going on. I remember getting into metal. I think my first record I ever bought was an Alice Cooper record when I was like 9 or 10 because I liked the artwork. Then got into it's like Marilyn Manson and like slowly. Funnily enough, the most formative experience, which a musical experience around about that time. Beyond the fact that obviously growing up in the Arab world, I was exposed to a lot of Arabic music, and especially just music everywhere at all times. Was when I was a teenager. Kuwait's kind of an unusual place because obviously it's a dry country. There's not that much to do. You just kind of like walk around the desert all day. I used to play a lot of football, and like you just walk from like Bacala to Bacala, which are like these kind of imbis or like bodegas getting drinks. But then at the same time, there were also tons of troops there. So on occasion, you would go out as a teenager and just end up hanging out with like American or British troops who were around about like maybe 2 or 3 years older than you. And there was an American soldier who he must have been 18 or 19 who gave me a tape of Shellac of North America and Slint. It's a very unusual way to be exposed to that that kind of music. But I was like, oh, what's this? That's crazy. Anyway, so I don't know. I don't know how deep and biographical you want to be talking about music, but I was pretty much music obsessed as a teenager. I left home when I was 16, which was super young, and I moved to London by myself. And I actually I only applied to universities in London because I wanted to be around music, and basically spent the next few years trying to, join bands, go to as many concerts as I possibly could, and just immerse myself in it. And then, ended up working at an independent record label, I think by the time I was 19. So I just left university, called Southern Records, which it turns out was pretty formative in the sense that, one, it's a pretty formative institution. Most people now probably aren't familiar with it, but the guy who started Southern, John Loder, was kind of an informal member of Crass. He was like this computer scientist, ideologue, interesting guy who is credited by many, and I think this is less kind of a public discussion, but more like an intra-scene discussion, as being kind of one of the architects of the independent label as we know it. So he was like, had a bit of an entrepreneurial mindset, worked with Crass, who of course like the great crust punk band, and was like, hey, we can structure this and make our own networks. When he died, Ian Mackay of Fugazi, Discord, Minor Threat, so on, credited him as basically being, the architect of that protocol. Like Discord wouldn't have been Discord if it weren't for Loder. And I think there's many others from that particular kind of lineage of American independent music and British independent music who would credit him as that. And so from a very early age, went from playing in like hardcore metal bands, so on, to being exposed to, independent music infrastructure, and then, just kind of stuck around. I mean, there's a point, I think now, which is funny because I'm in a way only tangentially involved in music now, but I had a good run. I don't think there's anything I haven't done within a musical context in the last 20 years. Like I put on shows, I've been in bands, I co-ran the label Pan for a number of years. Been on stage, released record. I basically there's not like anything I don't think I've done. I've picked bands up. I've ran press campaigns for them. I've been on the subject of press campaigns for them.
So we're just going to
magazines.
Interview you for every single podcast. And
maybe, but it's funny. But that was basically my whole identity for nearly 20 years was just being a scene person in independent music, in strange, oftentimes independent music. And so, and I think just generally, I'm like, it's good to understand that, but I'm like rather obsessive, and I'm a very committed person. So it's like, in retrospect, I don't have much cause to think about it, but in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense that, I just kind of threw myself into it and then wanted to know everything and get to know everyone and do everything.
And do you think that those kind of the values and ethos of an independent record label and kind of growing up in that culture, does that inform kind of subsequent years and explorations in technology and sort of what you're doing now on the artist side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's I've always wanted to know how things work, and particularly when you're thinking about, I don't know, there's a number of different sides to like the culture industry broadly, right? There's kind of like promotional reality, right, which is like what most of the public will see, where you hear a record, you read a paragraph about it, or you see a snippet or the most flattering possible photograph of the person who allegedly created the record, right? That's kind of like what most people deal with. My early exposure to this stuff was just very different, where like before, and I mean, you may also remember the before times, right, where like it was very manual to get anything done. Seeing how records work was this rich, very nuanced context about culture that ended up kind of culminating in a record existing in the world and existing in promotional reality. But I was always involved on the back end, and so I think it's only in retrospect I think back to Southern, and I think back to Loader, who I rarely interacted with him, if I'm honest. He was already old, and regrettably he was quite sick when I worked there. But I think back and I do, not to get too esoteric. I won't say that, actually. I was going to say I think angels are real, but I kind of do think angels are real. But in retrospect, you're like, oh yeah, it's no surprise I ended up there, and it's no surprise that in the 20 years since, I've basically just ended up kind of repeating myself in an odd loop of being obsessed with infrastructure and the possibilities for abstracting away or forking away by just thinking about the most low level logic. And if you think about independent music, that was the miracle of it, right? Was that simply through thinking about different protocols of releasing things, or I mean, the reason why we called our podcast Interdependence, and why I've used this term interdependent music for a long time, thinking about kind of these splinter networks, they facilitated all this aesthetic, ideological diversity just through that simple gesture of creating a different kind of infrastructure, different kind of rules, and so and that, I mean, is a logical. Now I think about it biographically, that is a logical segue into being interested in internet protocols and what kind of rules, what kind of downstream impacts can come from slight deviations in rules in that sense. So it's no surprise. I think, as I said, I'm a manically obsessive person. So, I basically just, my brain is just on a constant loop thinking about basically the same thing, and then I end up in different contexts over time.
Strange loops. I love it.
Totally strange loops and strange rules. Yeah.
And in kind of researching, doing a little bit of research before our conversation today, I read one of your essays called the Money Ramble essay, which I think you've said you've taken down. So it might not be, if somebody's listening to this, they might not be able to find it anymore. But it talks a lot about, or you talked a lot in it about the kind of economics of independent music. And I think when we talk about independent music, I think probably economics is sort of one of the primary lenses to kind of look at it through. And sort of, I can't remember, it was halfway or towards the end of the essay, you sort of were making the point that the patronage model was and has been a successful system to fund, and I quote, fund transformative culture as it was before the era of mass-produced physical goods. Let's find ways to do it, more of it, openly. And I'm curious, I think you wrote that in 2013, so just over 10 years ago. And I'm curious, do you still feel the same way? Do you still feel like patronage is a kind of really important, crucial model?
Yeah, more so than I did then. I probably shouldn't have taken it down because that makes it sound very prescient. More so than I even did then, in honesty. I mean, I think we'll jump around a lot, obviously, because we have this kind of AI question, that small thing. But increasingly, I've worn many hats and seen many things, and ultimately, the miracle of independent music or culture more broadly is that that you do find a lot of people who are prepared to pay for it, right? I mean, it's important to remember, and I think this is really important context with the AI question too. That ultimately, when we talk about the culture industry, we often rate limit ourselves to what barely 100 years. Like there's like a 50-year purple patch that we think about, right? And then we don't think about the Lord knows how many years that came before that, and the years
millennia.
Yeah, exactly. And the years that I believe quite strongly, that are coming. I mean, I think in many ways we are in the 20th century, 21st century culture industry now, right? There's kind of dregs that hang on from that, romanticizing that purple patch of 50 odd years. But I think it's important to think beyond that. And patronage is what it comes down to, right? I mean, you can understand the history of art, aesthetics, abstraction quite clearly, and oftentimes the shortest path to understand it is to follow the money, And I don't mean that in a cynical way, right? I mean, you could say that in a cynical way and suggest that everything is corrupted. Rather, I don't think it's that. I think it's more simple than that. It's that it takes money to do ambitious things, and the miracle of independent music. That purple period is that people organized in such a way that there were funds. It was interdependent, right? There were funds to support wonderful, ambitious splinter cultures that dried up. And so, if you want to do ambitious things, you need to find a way to fund that. And I think that that was also part of the reason I think around about 2013 when I wrote that I started getting very interested in the decentralized internet. So I think a year later I'd built a protocol called Saga that was my first jump into that. There were other people. I mean, I knew a guy at the time who was working on the diaspora protocol. We lived in San Francisco in 2013, and there was a lot of energy toward building kind of decentralized, federated, alternative networks. And then you fast forward 5 years from that, and the 4 or 5 years from that, the NFT was born, and all the kind of the drama that came after that about patronage. That and so I think ultimately patronage is good. We need more of it, and I don't think people getting the ick about finances helps anyone, including those same people.
Yeah, I think what I took away from that essay was really this idea that the money is there. The money, like, it exists in the system already within music culture and the industry, but you were essentially arguing that, like, let's just talk about it openly rather than trying to sort of keep it a secret.
Yeah, exactly. Because the other side too is that I mean, I have this term. It sounds annoying, but I've used this term for a long time as like a shorthand. I call there's a community of characters I describe as TIMs, so temporarily illiquid millionaires, right?
Okay.
And so a TIM I would describe is someone who, if you look at the culture industry more broadly, why is it that we get to hang on to older conceptions and older kind of romantic ideas of infrastructure that no longer work for most people, right? A lot of that, I believe, comes down to the fact that, over the course of the 20th century, cities became far more expensive to live in, right? So you couldn't just move to New York or London and bum around anymore and like join a band and pick up the dole or however it used to work, right?
Yeah.
And in parallel, there's also a large group of people, many of whom are great supporters of the arts and very nice people, but who don't really need to, who can live a break-even existence, right? If your parents were lucky enough to buy property in New York or London in the 70s or whatever, the way the economics works out is, you might stand to inherit more than anybody without that benefit could ever earn in their lifetime. Right. Yeah. And so you have an entire class of people that have been socialized in a world where a lot of status is conferred through association with the arts, who can take break-even jobs, right? And I mean, you'd see that even when I worked in London, right? People earning 20 grand a year for a high prestige job. And if you don't come from that background, you might look at that, do it for a couple of years and then be like, this isn't going to work, and you can say the same for artists, right? There's a lot of people where it's high prestige to pursue the arts, but if the economics of it don't work out, they aren't generative to sustain, let's say, a middle class of artist or a middle class of record label owner or something like that. Over time, what ends up happening is it ends up largely being dominated by people who don't need to make money. right? Now that's fine. The challenge of that, of course, is that can also kind of keep alive a myth that things are working, right? It can keep alive a kind of myth where it's like, well, things are still working. There's still gallery shows. There's still records being released. People are still on tour. The old labels still have people working there. It presents a bit of a mirage that doesn't reflect the underlying shifting trends of things, And so the only plea at that time, I think, this was 2013. So, Holly had released a record. She was on tour at the time. I had a job still had a job in tech at the time. Was just saying, I don't think that we are going to be able to diagnose the problem or have an honest conversation about the future of the arts or the future of arts prospects unless we just clear the room a little bit of some of these myths, and of course over time, I think I wasn't the only one, I think, asking those questions at the time, but I think that intuition has been validated, right? Where the streaming economy, I think it's 0.00001% make 70-80% of the money. Now, of course, that's
the power law is just crazy.
It's nuts. And of course that's distorted in a sense because there's more people releasing stuff. So, but generally speaking, that kind of middle class tier of people who could kind of get by has been decimated, in music specifically. There's other areas where it's maybe grown, right? Streaming, YouTubers and so on and so forth. There's probably a bit more of a curve there, but but it's abstract to think about because when Holly and I met in the mid-aughts, we lived in Berlin, and we would have neighbors who would sustain themselves from selling tapes on Blogspot. Wow. And it was never a luxurious living, but these are noise artists, experimental musicians, or so on, who could actually get by in a major cultural center selling tapes. That was a thing. And in many ways, having that long context, if you look at the kind of aesthetic fallout, I've said this a lot of times, like a lot of the aesthetic breakthroughs of the 2010s in music, at least, things that were fated as being, wow, these kind of crazy sounds or aesthetics or ideas can actually be traced back to a lot of that culture. This is a totally deviating, but a lot of people I knew from noise, weird experimental music at that time have gone off in these different directions, and they're the producers for the biggest pop records today. They're the people doing the biggest soundtracks today. And it's like, well, yeah, you needed the economics, as kind of humble as the economics were at the time. You need some kind of, whether institutional or economic framework, to support the advancement of weirdos. And that is ultimately what ends up breathing new life into these kind of cultures. And that was actually, I may be wrong because I may be also disconnected, but at least in my experience, that was the last big wave of those weirdos who were sustained and for long enough for the whatever weird mutations in aesthetic or ideas they had to really mature and catch on, and then we saw kind of the rise of social media and so on and so forth, and a lot of that just kind of dried up.
Do you think it was related to the kind of fall of physical media? Because you mentioned the folks making tapes and selling them on Blogspots, and obviously the big cash cow of the record industry in the 90s was CDs, and before that tapes, and before that vinyl, and physical media was such a huge part of it. So as that kind of slowly disappeared, I think that was a big part of hollowing out of this sort of middle class of musicians, and maybe physical artists a little bit less so because they've always sort of dealt in that medium. But I think that's definitely on the music side.
Yeah, I think so, but I think it might almost be kind of coincidental that it happened to be physical. I think that the physical media, no doubt, for that period of time would sustain people, but ultimately it was that was an excuse to transact, right? That was an excuse to transact from one person to the other. There's nothing you don't necessarily need a physical object to transact, right? It was
true.
It was more, I would argue, maybe the streaming logic. This is Holly's old point, but the streaming logic just does not work for. Okay, so I'll give a spiel on this. I remember vividly toward the late tens, kind of, the late aughts, early tens. There was a lot of excitement, and we were also maybe swept up into this a little bit, where you still had the existing press infrastructure, right? So being on the front homepage of Pitchfork meant it really meant a lot. It may still mean something today, but it certainly meant a whole lot more back then, right?
Yeah.
And so there was this really interesting, exciting moment that crested maybe in the early tens, where you got, because everything was online and you had all these social networks that at the time were really about like recommending people things. I mean, that's also abstract. It's like there was no political kind of pretense to Twitter or whatever. Twitter was like, oh, I heard this cool record, you should check it out, right? I mean, it was really like a very naive time. But there was this interesting purple period where it seemed momentarily that the weird music noise artist from wherever and Beyonce were visible on the same page. And there was a lot of excitement. And actually, I can credit a lot of Holly's maybe early career to that. It was nuts. I mean, it was really common, for example, early YouTube, early Twitter, like if Pitchfork or Fader or whoever covered something, you could get 1 million views on a really odd music video that day. And you would see it come in and you're like, wow, there's this kind of equal opportunity. That was the naive pretense. There's this kind of equal opportunity. Wow, imagine how music's going to change. Regrettably, in retrospect, what became clear was that the equal opportunity was actually for everyone to present as a pop star, right? So you got an equal opportunity to spend a lot of time taking photographs of yourself, promoting yourself constantly, developing parasocial relationships with people. And so the equal opportunity was there to a degree, but the only people who really greatly benefited from it were those who took the opportunity to turn into an icon, right? To self-promote in this way. Whereas the music itself started to recede in value. Whereas before, and I mean, it certainly exists, this is how it was before the internet, the only way you had to interface with an artist was through a record, right? So you would get these odd records, you would have record stores, blah, blah, blah. And the way you would understand them is through a piece of music. That was like the main communication channel. That shifted, to the point whereby, without naming names, I definitely know a lot of people in the music industry, where the record in itself is kind of like an excuse to kickstart. You're basically like now your career is a constant PR campaign for records people forget about in a week, usually, right? And so that shift occurred, but as I said, I don't think it has anything to do with the decline in physical media per se. But physical media was a well-established habit where people paid $10 to listen to something. This is Holly's point about streaming. She never believed it would work out for the weird musicians. And honestly, if you look at the streaming numbers of like some of the most important, weird experimental pieces of music from the 20th century, this would show you that the important part about physical media, at least at that time, was that you had to pay $10 to access an idea. So if you were making the strangest record ever and then a few people knew about it or a label was putting it out there, if you were the kind of person who wanted to participate in that, you would pay one time and that person would receive whatever, $7 from the $15 that was exchanged. Now streaming changed all of that, right? Where you didn't have to pay anything. And in fact, the per stream valuation of things, which works really well for Taylor Swift when you're expecting to get billions of plays on something, just does not work for music that is not intended to be listened to in the background all the time, right? Like, there's a whole very important, I would argue, category of music that you're not supposed to listen to all the time. That's not its function, right? Like it's art music, weird music, whatever. But when when the logic flipped to this per stream valuation, which is very much a value call, right? It was a value call by Web2 to suggest that the thing that you listen to the most is the best or deserves the most money, right? Which is a value that is a value proposition that's worth intense scrutiny, I think.
I think it was rooted in this idea that we now live in this attention economy, and if you're listening to this thing or in mass, so many people are listening to it, then that's where the value should go, but purely based on kind of attention economy metrics and stuff like that, which interesting has this interesting parallel with what you were just saying about how so many musicians today, maybe the music is secondary and the kind of getting your
100%.
attention and your
Yep.
image and what you're putting out there, that's actually primary because we are in this attention economy.
Yeah, and it has been for 10 years. And of course, there's the astronaut meme where you could make the argument it's always been that way in some areas, right? Where, I mean, I brought up Alice Cooper earlier, right? Like there's that great film about his manager that I really enjoyed, who they were the original. It's actually really good. I forget what it's called, but it's worth watching. But they were like tricksters who were like, we're going to manipulate the media to make it seem like he eats bats or something, and that's how they got their start, and so there's always been these games. But somewhere else there is just this question of the art of music, or whatever it is your art is, and there wasn't really a kind of sufficient way to value that with this attention economy logic, right? And it's very rational. I mean, I think that the logic is a pretty sound one. I mean, but it just omits all this other stuff that I would argue brings great value. It's just inconveniently there's no model within that logic to value that stuff, right? And so, yeah. So I mean, so as I say, I think it does correlate with the decline in physical media, but it doesn't have to be a physical thing. It rather is just saying, yeah, if you are one of a community of 10,000 people who is into, some esoteric thing that is never going to be played in stadiums, it's kind of incumbent on you to find a means to support that. Otherwise, it will disappear, or it will become a hobbyist thing, and that's fine too. That's totally fine. But that's kind of what happened, and I think yeah. So, yeah, patronage is important.
I guess that kind of brings us up to today, and it sort of feels like we're at this precipice, or maybe we're actually already kind of leaning over it with LLMs and AI technology starting to sort of be more and more dominant within every aspects of our lives, whether it be kind of just technology, but also music, art, culture, all these different areas. And I think the full impact and hit, especially in terms of jobs and economics and things like that, it doesn't feel like it's been felt yet. But we're starting. I think you and Holly are clearly exploring the boundaries of when it comes to art and music and culture. What does this mean? Like, what are going to be the implications of this? So I'd love to spend a little bit of time to talk about The Call, which was the exhibition that you guys held at the Serpentine in London. And I guess maybe start with sort of what was the kind of the background and the idea behind it.
Yeah, well, the background, I mean, first off, I agree with you. I don't think that the machine learning kind of AI moment has even begun to get strange yet. So we started toying and toying around with ML. I guess it was like 2016, so it's more or less 10 years ago. And put a bunch of time into. So I remember like working with TensorFlow or whatever it was at the time to play with these models. And we initially had the idea. To train a model and make a record with it. And at the time, our options were very, very limited. We ended up kind of agreeing on training a kind of very primitive voice model at the time, because we were like, but I often think back to those first kind of conversations we had in the studio between us and a guy called Jules Laplace, who's a really interesting developer friend of ours who was helping us kind of get our head around everything. Where the initial questions seem kind of really kind of relevant today, right? So the first question was, it would be kind of boring to train a model and then, just go ahead and release the music, as is. It would be far more interesting for this model to be considered a member of an ensemble or something, right? That was our initial ideas. Like, it would be nice to have this as another reference point in the process of making a record. That was the first one. The second one was, of course, when you're invited to train a model, literally the first thing you have to think about is, what do you train it on, right? So like, and of course, yeah, the lights flash in front of your eyes where you're like, oh, you could be Alice Cooper's manager and train this on Michael Jackson and get into a lawsuit and get in the press, and and then we're like, no, that would be a really shitty thing to do. It would be far more interesting to train it on our own work, or maybe even better, think about putting together an ensemble of people whose goal was to, while we were workshopping what this record would be, the goal was to also train the model, and so the model would be aware, right? The model would have some context for what was being made, and then would be able to respond to it. And so we put together a training ensemble of singers. People refer to it as a choir, but it was more informal than that. It was really just a group of singers. And so for between 2016 and, I'd say, 2019, we would have weekly singings in our studio with a group of people who had nominated themselves to be part of this process, wonderful musicians, artists. And we would cook soup and sing together and then record everything. And then when people would leave, we'd feed it to the model. And so that ended up becoming a record.
Little model in the corner,
Exactly.
Everybody else ate soup.
Model you can have. Exactly. And so that ended up being a record called Proto that we put out in 2019, I guess. And all this stuff, all the stuff that people, I mean, not to sound too self-aggrandizing, but literally all the conversation there, I think we had both anticipated that and come up with an answer for it by 2019. So with the basic principle being, okay, this is going to be a really big thing. The data provenance issue is going to be a huge culture war, and it's going to cause a huge stink. What are the ways out of this potentially? One way out of it is you start thinking about training models and integrating models into your practice as fundamentally the opportunity here, because who gives a crap? I don't want to listen to 1 million songs a minute or whatever it is these models will be able to generate, and probably can now with parallel processing. I want this to be participatory. So we started looking at group singing, the history of group singing, and being like, well, it's kind of interesting to train a model on a choir, because the whole point of a choir is that you participate and you're there. So if you could listen to infinite recordings of a choir, but it doesn't really capture the whole point of the exercise. Going back to this point earlier of thinking about art outside of a 50-year purple patch of the 20th century culture industry, right? Just like, and the other thing we thought about at the time was, we were like, it's actually kind of an important gesture. At the time, this was kind of, we were playing a lot of big festivals and so on. And you could see it, again, going back to economics, you could see this cost-cutting exercise where the number of people on stage started shrinking and the screen behind them started getting bigger, right? So you end up, it would be like, used to be like a 4-person band, and then it ended up being a DJ who could and DJs are these economic juggernauts, right? Because they can play a new set every night. They don't have to per se make anything, right? So they can just be there every night, and then there's a big screen behind them that flashes and it looks great. And you're like, exactly. And some people do it well, right? But you could see this weird economic thing happening where we're like, in opposition in a way to this kind of slide, it would be economically very poor judgment on our part, but the right gesture to make an AI record where when you came to see the show, there were 14 people on stage. And so, and so so we ended up doing that. Okay, so that's a bit of a preamble. And actually, my favorite compliment we ever received was not intended as a compliment. I remember we played in 2019. We played a Red Bull event in New York, and there were a couple thousand people there. And over the course, we played the record for people. There were a ton of people on stage. We had this whole thing where we would do call and response singing with the audience, and that would be training the model. We were collecting data for the model for the next one, and so we would have these big group singings, thousands of people in some cases. And afterwards, one of the curators was like, "What did that have to do with AI?" And I was like, "Thank you," Thank you. We've managed to avoid all the cliches. There were no robots on stage. There was no anything. And my response rather smugly was, "You will see."
Yeah.
And hopefully now it's a bit more clear what we were onto then, which is that ultimately, yes, AI models are all of us and no one in particular. They require this data. And actually, we need to think about new rituals, interactions to kind of deal with this. Like, what's the point of music? If you can generate anything, the point is it's about people, right? That's the point. So yeah, fast forward, we've done lots of other stuff. I mean, Holly Plus, and we've done lots in this domain. But for the Serpentine show, given that this conversation has matured a great deal, we thought it would be nice. There was basically interest from the curators to really kind of formalize a lot of this work we'd done. And so we were like, okay, well, we'll take that same principle and we'll apply it here and do like what we did. We put together a songbook explicitly for AI training. So that's another big opportunity, right? Like everyone's read from like Timmett scripts or these kind of scripts to train your voice. We're like, well, actually what's happening there is this is a performance. So why don't we formalize this into a performance where we wrote a book that anyone can read from, and basically if you sing all the songs in the book, you will have given a model in everything it needs to model your voice accurately. So all the phonemes and all the notes and so on. We'll take this book on tour throughout the UK. So we went to 15 choirs, some amateurs, some professional, across the UK. Create a large data set that they will have governance over. So we created a kind of an IP primitive data trust type deal where they could democratically own that together and vote on what was done with it. We had to negotiate with them to train on it. Mm-hmm. And then we'll train models that we showed in the gallery alongside a bunch of the objects that we built. We'll train models on their collective voice, right? And just see what happens, right? If you and so yeah, and it turns out the models were very beautiful. They produced some gorgeous kind of music, and the whole principle was basically saying, okay, this is maybe a more beautiful protocol to think about AI training, and you can extrapolate from that, which is very pregnant in an issue in the UK at the moment, and certainly was a year ago when we did this. It really kind of hopefully gives you pause to think about maybe different kinds of social contracts that are available to us given the scale of this challenge, which is to say, okay, we're working with choirs who have kind of elected to be part of this weird experiment, but one could imagine a scenario where you restructure aspects of the economy around, voluntarily contributing data to a commons, and then a populace enjoying the benefits of the emergent outputs of those models. That actually is some kind of a way of thinking about this that is generative and constructive and benefits more people, right? But of course, running an experiment like that in an art gallery with singers is far more bloodless and less controversial, far less bloodless and less controversial than thinking about health data or who knows what else. Yeah, but it worked really well. I mean, the show was received very well. The models were remarkable in the end, I think, considering the I wasn't clear that was going to happen when we started the process, but they ended up sounding great. And
how, what did you find in terms of the governance side of things? Because I'm very curious in terms of, I'm guessing 15 choirs or so. We're talking dozens, if not hundreds of people.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Because I think that's one of the things that, obviously maybe there's a tangent here with kind of DAOs and sort of the Web3 wave that came through a couple of years ago, is this idea that I think the intention is that we would like to have more people participating in the governance of an entity or a project or whatever it may be.
Yep.
But I think in practice, what we saw, at least in Web3, was that there are some challenges there. So I'm just curious, I talked about this a little bit with Yancey Strickler, who co-founded Kickstarter, is now working on a new project called Meta Label.
Mm-hmm.
And his focus was very much like, he wanted to break it down into a small group of people, because if it's say half a dozen or so, there's this dependability on the others. Whereas once you start to scale to dozens or hundreds, there are more there's dynamics that sort of appear within you trying to govern something. So I'm just curious, in what you guys have been doing with the choirs, or maybe with the Holly Plus DAO, what have you encountered on that side of things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, well, with the call and the data trust, to give credit to, so Serpentine's an anomalous institution. They have a lab called the Future Art Ecosystem that has helped a great deal with this, and is really, I mean, they spent a lot of time thinking about the law and thinking about the kind of infrastructural ins and outs of this. So the proposal came up that we would hire a data delegate who basically ends up working. So her name's Jennifer Ding, and she basically ends up working kind of in an almost like quasi political role, where it was her job saying, okay, well, there's a lot of people here who are all going to have their own kind of preferences. What if you just had a delegate, which is funny because that model works in crypto too, right? There's a lot of, you can vote for delegates to kind of make decisions on your behalf. That's one way to make the complexity problem a little less complex, right? As you have, it's reinventing the wheel a little bit, but it kind of works.
I guess it's kind of like representative democracy. You're sort of
that's exactly it. So
somebody. Yeah, cool.
That's exactly it. And so she spent a lot of time kind of synthesizing the concerns and questions of the group, and then that made it far tidier and easier to speak to them. She did a great job on that, and so that was the way we dealt with that. I mean, with DAOs generally, I mean, Holly Plus, so on and so forth. It's interesting. I mean that I feel quite strongly. I mean, I've been interested in crypto for a long time, and DAOs were my first. Was actually the reason I got super into it, more so than NFTs initially, or whatever. But basically, it's this idea of saying, okay, well, you can start new institutions on remotely. I mean, it's just like pseudonymously, and in some ways, I feel like they're, I mean, there are of course many famous failed experiments, many kind of more humble experiments that I certainly wouldn't discount as a failure. But they were definitely before their time. I mean, I feel like whether it be called a DAO, the idea of kind of finding formal ways for people remote from each other to kind of start new organizations together and deal with all that governance feels very important, and also feels like where this AI conversation ought to go, right? Which is, thinking about more formal structures for people to enter into, whether it be their data or training models, or more bespoke, tailored intelligence environments that are contained within a company or a practice or a profession or whatever, or a university, which is I think also where it's going to go. You're going to start to see more kind of clusters of guild like structures, or collectives basically. That seems inevitable, and so so while DAOs, I think, as with a lot of things in crypto, honestly, is like you're really often dealing with the bleeding edge. You're often dealing also with the kind of characters that frequent the bleeding edge, which can also be quite extreme characters.
Maybe a few Tims there as well.
100%, and a lot of very liquid millionaires too, right?
True.
So you're like, you're really dealing, you're really kind of on the front lines there, but at the same time, I think a lot of those experiments are very justified and likely will be proven to be quite prescient over time, just as we see this kind of stuff play out. But for our purposes, I mean, we take quite seriously, and we have done for, as I say, about 10 years. Like, our practice is really very much about kind of setting up these kind of conditions for art to happen. We've referred to it in the past as like protocol art. We might actually be releasing a book on this to kind of flesh out the concept a bit further. But I think it's kind of important because it's really basically saying, like, in order to understand the project, whether it be the exhibition work we do or the records or any of the art projects we do, you really just kind of have to zoom out to look at the kind of the rule set that we've put together for it in order to understand the media that comes out of it. And I think that approach is gonna likely again feel a bit more sensical as we increasingly see, the fungibility of media, right? Like as media just becomes near infinite, or literally infinite, going forward. That actually, yes, what is it that we value? We value a special vantage point, a practice, a protocol, a way of being from an artist, or we also value that a way of being or a protocol of a community, right? That actually hardcore music, don't follow it so much anymore, but weirdly it was the strange rules and rituals between people that was the most important part. That I can go on YouTube right now and find whatever hardcore records were released this year, and they'll probably sound a little bit like Terror or whoever, and there's always some like small aesthetic mutations, but the music's just kind of an excuse for everything else to happen, where you're basically like, it's a group of shared people under shared principles that define themselves as such, and they enjoy being part of those communities so much that they're not fussed if the record sounds like the last one. That's like, it's just an excuse to be in a room with people, or it's an excuse to meet your partner, or to be able to travel from Berlin to Peru and know that there's a group of 100 people you could hang out with and immediately get along with. So those sticky ties are actually, again, if you zoom out from the 50-year 20th century culture industry, those sticky ties were always the point, right? That's like, that was the genesis of art as a communication language or coordination protocol, or whatever, why ever we have it, was to create bonds between people. Quite literally, I could go into that a lot more, but and that will endure. And so that, all these questions about, now we can generate, I mean, VO just came out yesterday, and, models will just get better and better and better. Everything, all the media we share is autoregressive. There's nothing to impede. There's no scaling problem with this stuff. You'll be able to generate music that sounds great to your ears, and movies that you can watch. That's priced in. That's already going to happen. So what, right? That there, we're all we're doing in being melancholy about that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I had to kind of wade through the bog of despair about this in the late 10s, because it was already really obvious back then. But once you get over the despair, you're like, well, what's the real point? The real point is people and the strange configurations of people. That's the reason you get involved. The media itself is not the point. The media itself is not the art. The art is a matter of consensus. It's a matter of doing things, right? So,
like the media is a means to connect people.
100%. And so the fact that now you can generate a gajillion pieces of media that sound like a certain thing imperils a whole industry that is, not that old, or at least asks some pretty existential questions of a particular industry. But that says nothing about art or music. And in some ways, there's also something kind of liberating to that. Not to be overly dismissive, because I do, I lament the death of many different infrastructures that I've been a part of and that helped me form who I am. But there's also something liberating to the idea of, there's also something liberating to that, or at least there's an interesting new challenge there, which is to say, wow, now we get to be really imaginative, because we can't depend on music or a music industry being the same as it was. It just isn't anymore. It's kind of pointless to pretend it will continue to be. I just don't think that's on the table at all.
Yeah, it's nearly sort of like there's going to be such a fundamental underlying shift and change that there is this exciting opportunity to rethink, like you were saying, like, what is kind of the point of all of this in a way?
Yeah.
I think maybe this would then be an interesting point to talk a little bit about Spawning, which is a project that I think you're co-founder of. And this kind of links to the point we were talking about in terms of sort of data governance. It's something that you've set up around data governance for generative AI. And there's a couple of projects that I think have come out of that. One called Have I Been Trained? And one called Kuduru. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah. Yep.
I'd love to kind of like talk a little bit about those, and maybe help people understand what that's about.
Totally. Yeah. So I mean, all right. So Spawning, we came up with the term Spawning. This was in the late 10s, and it was really just it was a word we used internally to help communicate to people the difference between what happens in a model and sampling.
Okay.
Right. So sampling, everyone knows what a sample is. You take David Bowie's voice and you can, change the context in which it's heard. You can pitch it up, you can pitch it down, you can, mess with it, stick distortion on it, whatever. But that's a sample. But spawning, we were trying to talk about, is a bit more kind of reproductive in the sense that you can take a corpus of data of David Bowie singing stuff. A model can analyze those patterns, and then you can have Bowie sing anything, right? So it's this generative, generative AI, right? It's this generative reproductive relationship to data that's very different from sampling. And people use often, I get why people like to talk about sampling and file sharing, but it's just it felt important for us to come up with a new word because we were like, this is just very different. And if you confuse the two, you're missing out, honestly, because the metaphor only extends so far. And so anyway, so we'd done this project Holly Plus, which was kind of an experiment in, Holly released a voice model of her voice, and her whole approach was like, I don't care, anyone can use it. Actually, I encourage people to make work as me. In fact, I want to set up a protocol to allow for people to be me if they want, like that's fine. That seems like a natural extension of this tech. Like, let's see where that goes. And so we ended up presenting that at the TED conference. I think it was in early 22 or late 21. I can't remember, in Vancouver. And this was before like AI mania. So, GPT wasn't out yet, whatever that, and it went really well. I mean, the talk went very well. It was very well received in the room because people were like, what the hell? Like, we had an artist we know called Fur was singing in real time through Holly's voice, and we were explaining how in the near future people will be able to share identities as fluidly as they share instruments or whatever, and that's kind of cool. Wonder where that's going to go. That seems interesting. And so anyway, so while we were there, we had a bunch of people approach us. I mean, basically everyone. And we met a guy called Adam, who was like, "Would you ever make this a company?" And we're like, "Well, no." Like, that sounds no, or at least also, I mean, not being naive, we're like, we could make this a company, and we're not going to be able to compete with Google, and like all these organizations just have the resource asymmetry here is not going to work. But there is this kind of wicked problem of web scale data scraping that's required to train these large models, and nobody at the time, and honestly very few since, have actually spent time thinking about it. It was like this interesting challenge of like, okay, we know that in order to train these mega models, you need to scrape as much publicly available data as possible. We know that that's also going to be a massive culture war. I mean, we'd spoken to almost everyone you can think of in the AI industry, even by the late 10s, and being like, what are you going to do about the impending culture war over data? And people didn't have great answers, but it was like just obvious that this was going to blow up. And so we're like, well, okay, what we'll do is with Jordan Meyer, our co-founder, Patrick Hupner, we put together a website, super easy, called haveibeentrained.com, that basically lets you see what data is being ingested into these models. And then we're like, it would be kind of interesting, again, trying to show imagination about this, to say, copyright, there's this kind of wicked problem with it. We could go into it if you want. It's obviously in the news every week, but it's not a perfect fit for this problem.
Well, it's
what if we just
the right to stop somebody from copying your work, but not necessarily training on it.
Well, there we go, and which is the difference between sampling and spawning, right? So, so we're like, well, but it's also clear that you need to establish some norms here. So why not just, now that we have a lot of traffic on this site where people are checking if the data is in there, just to run an experiment and say, okay, we can have you register an opt out or an opt in. You see your data on there. Let's register that. So we ended up doing that. Initially, it was really well received. I think we had like 80 million individual pieces of media opted out initially. And so we're like, okay, there's something here. So we then made a Python package so that basically any developer who's training a model could observe those opt-outs and respect them. Made it super easy for them. You just stick it in your pipeline. It's not costly or anything. And then just started building more open source tools to try and instantiate this standard. And so I think now, I mean, up until now, it's been running for a couple of years. We have like at minimum like 3 to 4 billion pieces of media that have been opted out, and that's minimum because the number could be a lot higher because we built all these other tools that like opt out by domain or opt out whatever. We haven't actually analyzed,
And
exactly
are
how many
these
pieces.
individuals, or are they entities like Getty Images, or like who is opted?
Both. Yeah. So there's tools for individuals. We built a thing called AI.txt, which is like an update on robots.txt. Just kind of works better with the system. We built, a pretty nifty tool to also help to opt out duplicates, because it turns out this might be too in the weeds, but that's actually one of the biggest problems around an opt out is that you may have your own personal website and you may say, this is my record cover, I don't want that in AI training. But the problem is, if your record cover is worth anything, there's tens of thousands of other copies of it on other people's servers, right? And so we figured out a pretty good way to analyze your record cover once we know that it's you, and then inform the AI developer anytime something that looks like it goes up, so we can automatically opt out your duplicates. Big problem. Took a lot to figure out.
It's like a YouTube content ID for the entire web.
Pretty much, yeah. And so we put that together and basically started to advocate for it, which is very difficult when you talk about like web standards. This is a pretty difficult scenario. In many ways, I think we were too early because you now have, there's a lot of people in the policy space. I mean, I know it's been very influential on the policy side. It's referenced a lot in government documents and so on when they're talking about this, but they're now thinking about, how would we have an opt-out work? And we're having to have the same conversations we were having internally in 2022 with people now being like, oh no, don't do that. Trust me, we've thought about this already. Use this. It works. It's honestly baffling to me, but somehow in this process, I think we've become like the experts on how this would work. I've spoken to people at every company, and I'm like, we're a year or two ahead of your thinking on, but whatever. Anyway, so we put that together. That's all open, free, as kind of an ideological gesture of being like, what if we just came up with a different kind of IP standard here that would work better? And what the other cool thing that's nice about the opt-outs is that it's also very, I think, a very kind of progressive measure for the open source community, because functionally, I mean, people talk about this like it's a bug, but I think it's a feature. Functionally, having an opt-out in policy basically means that 90+% of data that's available is ostensibly for the purpose of training public domain. So that means that a lot of open source initiatives can just go ahead and train on a bunch of stuff. Because an opt-out, in a way, it turns out that the vast, it's really only a small minority of people who would want to opt out. These are artists or newspapers or something like this who are like, hey, we have plans for our own data. Please don't take it. We'd like to make our own models or whatever it is going forward. But that's a really small group of people. The vast majority of data that gets ingested into these models is kind of orphaned. Nobody would care if it was in there, And under a very kind of, let's just even pretend the copyright was being breached here, which is not settled. Courts will talk about that. But let's just pretend that was the case. That would require, 90+% of data on the open web being accounted for by somebody in order to get their permission to use it for these models. And how are you going to organize that? I mean, that's really tough. So we put that together as like the ideological gesture of saying this is a way for this to work out kind of nicely, right? Like you could still have AI models. People who really care about their data can have it out there. You're coming up with a new standard. Holly calls it like data manners, right? It's just like this is a new norm, and then we continued that work. When you bring up Kuduru or Kuduru, I don't know how you pronounce it. It's an old like Mesopotamian word or something. But that was kind of like the other side of it, saying like, okay, we can build the carrot, which is this beautiful gesture of saying we can have our cake and eat it. You can keep your data if you want to. We can have AI models, perfect harmony. I mean, of course, it didn't work out like that, but hypothetically, it could be very harmonious. What about the stick, right? Like, what?
Yeah, I guess the fundamental kind of background thing that's maybe not being said there in that first model is like it requires the respect of
Mhm.
people who are doing the training and running
It
the
does.
models.
It does. And we thought we put together a compelling idea because it was
Yeah.
like, well, look, you know, when you're talking about these trillion token models, if you're losing a few billion pieces of media from that, you're not stressed.
You're not bothered.
That's exactly, you're just not stressed. So it's like there's no skin off your back. And actually, I personally think, I mean, we can get into the culture wars if you want. I mean, I've been drowning in them for years on this AI data thing, but like, it's, if you're willing to kind of not be stubbornly kind of immovable on this, there is this nice middle ground where you're like, yeah. So we think we think it was a very clever proposal.
Yeah.
Let's see how it works out. I think that it is honestly an inevitability. Whether or not everyone respects it is another question, right? But
Yeah.
I think it is ultimately the most sensible conclusion to come to, and regrettably, we came to it a bit early, and that we have to again repeat ourselves and be like, it's the only way I can see anything working out, absent complete chaos. Or
and fast forward today, I think you guys are training a huge model on public domain images that are definitely in the public domain, right? I can't remember the name of the
public diffusion.
Public diffusion.
Imaginatively, we called it public diffusion. Yeah, we're training that right now. Exactly. So that's the other side too, is just being like, let's try and find all the public domain data. We released a big data set called PD12M that's like huge, and all public domain. You can just use it for whatever you want. It's been I forget how many times it's been downloaded for training, but it's a lot of times. And then we're like, yeah, well, we could also just, as a hedge against anything sensical happening, we could also just try experiment with training foundation models that nobody owns. And then you can fine tune them on your own thing and then just go forward with no worries about legal repercussions. I mean, in many ways, I mean, falling on this, we're very pro AI. I'm also personally frustrated. I'm like, God, this rights issue is kind of a pain because it means that I personally have no interest in making a record that sounds like Michael Jackson. I have personally no interest in making a Star Wars whatever people are worried about. But because of the threat that somebody might do that, I'm really constrained as to what I can make and how I can experiment with this new medium that's going to be the definitive medium of our lifetime, the definitive medium of the next 100 years. I can't do it. Google gets to do it. I can't personally experiment because of all this tape. It's silly, and I as I say, I could care less about Star Wars. Never been into it. Don't. So the other side, really, which is the danger, is we put together Kuduru, and Kuduru is basically a kind of listening. It's like a nodal listening network, where the idea there is we could monitor web traffic, identify who was scraping rather than just simply kind of crawling, and shut them down. So basically, it turns out, going back to the interdependence idea, if you have whatever, like, a couple thousand web domains, they can communicate with each other and be like, what are the chances that this crawler is crawling, hundreds of these domains at the same time? That's clearly not a human, right? And they're crawling all these that exist in this one data set. They're scraping it. They're scraping a data set. So once you do that, you can just cut off the IPs, which we thought was very novel. We built this network of like listening nodes, and we did a performance. We staged a Kuduru performance. This is in 2023, where we shut down global image AI training for 2 half-hour periods, where we just had a button where like turn network on, gone. And really, the point to do that, one, it's really cool, but number two, the point of the exercise was to show the stick and to be like, look, guys, like, if we can't be adults about this is actually the future of the web. The future of the web is this adversarial environment where anyone who has any data worth a damn doesn't open it up for the public. It's behind a paywall, right? Because the second it's behind a paywall, you have the right to bring suit, right? Because it's not publicly available. What you're talking about is really the death of the open web. And actually that sucks, right? That sucks less for me, even though that would make my web browsing experience really suck. But for the vast majority of people who use the web for basic utilities and don't have a lot of money to go spend on whatever, it really sucks for them. And that's kind of the dark side of this kind of bickering over this stuff and this kind of territorial, this territorialism, and also, let's be real, the silence about the data question. Because I know for a fact that everyone within the AI companies is thinking about it. A lot of them are thinking in a very sophisticated way about it, but no one talks about it because of it's very sensitive legally. And you're just like, look, guys, if we don't come to some kind of commonsensical norm here, this is the future. It's just an adversarial web where people are a balkanized web, which has already been happening, right? I mean, with the platform economy, that's the other striking thing about the platform economy, really, is when we start looking about public domain stuff. It's like public domain was basically an idea that died in 2012. It's an idea from Flickr times, blogging, because what's ridiculous about this data question is that since then, the vast majority of stuff that's posted online through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you gave up the rights to train on that the second you posted it.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is kind of immaterial for anyone of a certain age, because the second you post a TikTok or whatever, ByteDance has the ability to train on your stuff. You already signed it away, so it's
kind of the norms. Although I think people are caring about it more. I mean, I don't know if you saw just last week, somebody saw in SoundCloud's terms that they had kind of slipped in the right to train on your media. All media is training data, and did that kind of like a year ago or something, and it just kind of came out. And I don't know, maybe I'm in the Twitter spheres where this sort of thing matters, but people did seem to care. Like I think there is a growing sentiment that like, hey, you can't just come along and like scrape everything we've created and then create all this value over here. And it's there's definitely like questions of economics in that as well, because also, like you said, like who has the money to build some of these, buy the GPUs to build the models to do all these things. Like there's definitely a lot of ethical questions involved in that.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I think on principle, our position, I mean, we're happy for people to train on whatever we do, but that's our position for our art and stuff. On principle, I think people should have the right to opt out. I think that the opt-in kind of everything should be licensed scenario is one, untenable and kind of futile, because you're dealing with international competition here, right? So one person's famine is another person's feast, right? It's like this is again why we talk about the opt-out, where we're like, this is kind of win-win. Ultimately, I think the most important thing is, if I'm honest, a lot of the subtext of people caring about the data question, I think there's a lot going on there. I think number one, it's often a subtext of people kind of being upset about how the platform economy worked out and projecting that on AI, when AI could be anything at this point. Another is, we live in an attention economy, and so, the wicked part about this problem is that it doesn't work in quite the way people intuit it does, right? So on the one hand, yes, I think everyone should have the right to opt out of AI training should they want to. On the other hand, in a licensing paradigm, the numbers are likely to be so paltry for what one could expect to receive in compensation that it would be almost negligible to almost everybody. And so,
it's interesting, isn't it? Because like, are we just expanding the same problem that we have with the streaming economy, where it's, you're getting some fraction of a bajillion, but it's like a bajillion, and you're not really necessarily solving the economics there. And then it also introduces this question of like, how do you even divide it up in the model where
you can't.
It's
really
not my understanding. A lot of these they're black boxes, right? Like, how do you figure out all the weightings and what comes out of it?
Well, exactly, and again, a lot of this is counterintuitive because you really have to be in the weeds to understand it. Where you're like, you can't retroactively, you take an image from a diffusion model or whatever, and you try to attribute where the data came from to construct that one particular image, and it doesn't work. I mean, it's a philosophical position, if anything. You could say, I'm going to use Clip or some vision model to analyze it and find this most similar images in the data set that could possibly, and you'd be wrong. It would be an inaccurate, you'd be presenting a kind of, a flawed logic to you'd be inventing a bad system, basically, and also a system for copyright trolls to exploit, right? Because it's just this wicked problem. And this is the thing. I mean, the great opportunity, in a sense, is this is a time where extreme imagination is needed. Which I would argue is really the role for artists. I mean, that I didn't get the memo that, I didn't get the memo that artists just paint pictures. And, I always thought that like artists were supposed to be in the business of thinking about, we could do things differently. Like, embrace abstraction. I mean, if you want abstraction, this is about as abstract as things get, but it doesn't work out cleanly. And so if anything, I mean, without getting too much in the weed on any of it, it's just like, I think that, the principle we tried to embody, at least with let's say Holly Plus, I think is exactly the right way to approach it. Where you say, okay, the only way you can neatly attribute anything is if artists are free to release their own models or their own LoRa or fine tune whatever configuration you want. Then you can say that the product of that is 100% their responsibility. That's the way this has to shake out. So you have base foundation models that are hopefully widely available to everybody. This is why I like the idea of public models, and why I also don't like the idea of, copyright disputes limiting people's ability to experiment with these kind of things. Because the foundation model should be available to everybody, and then it's really about the fine tunes or the more local kind of small examples that you can then monetize. And this is again why the opt-out, I think, is elegant, because that basically says, I'm an artist. Please, the work that I make, I'm going to post it publicly because I want people to see it. Please don't include it in your models, or don't, I don't want an embedding in your system so that I can be prompted by name, so on and so forth. Because I'm going to use a foundation model, I'm going to fine tune it on my own work, and I'm going to come up with my own pricing mechanisms or whatever it is to try and explore, this new economy. You can't do that currently for various reasons. And I also think if I were really held to it, the most likely outcome is that, you have a couple of substrates or a couple of companies that are at this point so much more resourced that inevitably this will have to happen on their infrastructure. That's where it's going to go, right? It's just, but still, even in that point, I still think we need, So it's counterintuitive for people to understand, particularly people who are, maybe having a initial feeling of revulsion about their being slighted by so on and so forth. And you're like, I hate to say this, but like, hopefully in a few years' time, it will make absolute sense why I'm saying it's in your best interest to support wide distribution of intelligence and models in these circumstances, because that gives you more options. Because the one option that isn't on the table, for better or worse, is that this is going away. And I think there's been a lot of denial and a lot of kind of false prophets on this, where there's this suggestion that even if, let's say, some court somewhere determines that models are in breach of copyright or whatever, that this is disappearing. It's not. Like, this is us for the rest of our lives. We're going to live with more and more powerful models. And so there's no kind of like putting our head in the sand over this. Like, we have to figure this out. As I say, and it depends on your risk appetite. For us, we've gone through the roller coaster of like despair and denial. Exactly. A long time ago. We're just like, okay, we're in this now. Like, you got to, we've got to have a bunch of ideas about, how the creative economy works post this stuff. And I think there's honestly, I mean, I can think of 50 and I might be wrong about all of them. But you need more people on the same page, the same basic page, which is like, we're living with these things forever now. So,
I mean, I think coming back to what you were saying earlier, with this last 50, 60 years, if you consider that like this blip in time where, copyright as an international law sort of gave rise to these kind of culture industries, but consider that is actually the abnormality. That was like a kind of like a crypto spring, where like everybody was doing it. It was incredible. But if you zoom far enough out, it's like, actually, no, that was just an abnormality. That was just kind of how it was for 50, 60 years.
Yep.
Obviously, there are definitely people who are very entrenched in that and make their livelihoods from that. And so therefore, I can understand where they're coming from in terms of resisting the change. But I think you make a good point that, there's so many bigger forces tied to this outside of even just culture that this is like a steam train that's come in.
Yeah, and the one thing I would push back on there, which is there's 2 points. One is, this is not to say that I am not absolutely sympathetic, to the fact that this is going to be really turbulent for a lot of people, myself included. I mean, there will be job displacement. There will be. I think this is a bigger deal than the internet, if I'm honest. And
Yeah.
so
What
just
sort of
start out.
what's in your mind? Like, what sort of timelines are you thinking? Is this kind of the next 5 years, the next 15 years? Do you have any sense of?
It's hard to tell. I mean, honestly, if you'd have spoken to me in like 2020, I'd be like, oh yeah, the next 20 years we're gonna, and it moves so quickly. I think that I'm really hesitant to put a time on it. I think it's happening.
Accelerating.
I think it's happening really freaking soon. I mean, and again, there's a lot of cope out there. I mean, my position on this, just to say, my position on this is an incredibly sympathetic one. I mean, if you go back to 2016, 2017, there were 2 people on Twitter talking about data provenance and the fallout of this, and it was myself and this guy Neil Turkowitz, who's like a strong copyright guy, still going.
Neil Turkowitz, I have to look him up.
Yeah. I mean, you got to be really into copyright for Neil Turkowitz. But
I'm pretty into copyright.
But the point being is that, like, if you would have spoken to me in the late 10s, I'm like, stop all the training. We need to figure this out before and it just went. And I'm like, okay, I'm more of a pragmatist in this sense. So just to establish there's sympathy there. The kicker here, though, is I think that going back to the first part of our conversation, there's so many myths, right? And I think that sometimes in the zeal or the kind of the emotion, the catharsis of worrying about this stuff, we're sometimes prone to overemphasize the role of, for example, copyright, right? Like I published a thing, it was like a month or 2 ago, because the UK is debating this at the moment. And so I published this thing being like, look, DCMS, which is the part of government that looks
at culture, media, and sports.
Yes, thank you. They publish these reports, of saying like how much value the culture industry, or this broader understanding of the culture industry, contributes to culture. How much money comes in. And so I was like, okay, well, this is a good place to start. I'll look through and see how many of these industries are dependent on copyright. Because copyright is a very specific thing, right? It's like, and so, for example, in the fashion industry, yes, there are patterns, but they aren't posted publicly. So even if those patterns are very important to a business, yes, if you find the Prada patterns for that suit and you're training on that, you are going to pay a hefty fine because it's not publicly available. We're not talking about giving companies permission to train on everything in the world. They can't hack into your Synology, and we're talking about publicly available data. And I broke it down and I was like, this is a very different picture than people paint.
Yeah, I think I remember reading that you were talking about how a lot of it includes the live music sector, which obviously
absolutely. And you basically found out that, I forget the exact figure people would talk about, but it worked out that even me being incredibly generous, so anytime I had a doubt in my mind, I went pro copyright. It worked out to be 6.66% of the
quoted headline figure
of the headline figure that would even have anything to do with copyright. And as a practitioner, I mean, look, there are people out there, again, a lot of people come up are people who do work for hire, right? So people who do commercial composition. They know as well as anybody that there have been companies that have come in that have taken over that market, right? So you can go get stock royalty music of very high quality. I hear it all the time on my son's YouTube or whenever I'm on, so there's this kind of myth that there's a whole world of people out there doing commercial composition when actually that's not true. And the ones that often do so because, they have a reputation, their name gets associated with it, which you can't generate like Danny Elfman or whatever. Yes, you could generate a Danny Elfman composition, but the value is in his name, right? I mean, Hans, what's his name? The big film composer. What's his name?
Hans Zimmer.
Yeah, Hans Zimmer, exactly. Who has like whatever 40 people working for him churning out this stuff. Like, one, he's fine, but number two, there's this kind of so there's a mythology. Same with like Hollywood or whatever, where you're like, Hollywood's dying, like screw AI, and you're like, it's not AI. That's like, that's been happening for 20 years. AI is just, and the thing is that this is the one point I want anyone to take away from it, which I think is true for better or worse. It's just these AI systems will brutally expose myths. They just are. It's like a market. It's a force of nature. These models are math. There's something fundamental to them, and so when they get deployed and they spread around, you're going to learn the truth about what is valuable in those industries, what was maybe over, what is a myth that people keep in their head, and ultimately you have to fall on the side of being optimistic about it, because I don't think it's the death of art. I don't think it's the death of music. I think that these things will thrive, and I'm always happy to see people just blissfully going about their day, releasing records, going on tour, whatever, just not worrying about it, and people still show up. Like, I don't think that's going to change.
I was just going to say, I always maintain that like nobody's going to go see an AI robot DJ. Like, nobody. There's the human element is so crucial, especially on the live side of things, that I think that sometimes just gets overlooked and forgotten.
Totally. And another case in point, we do have AI robot DJs, right? And they DJ in hotels. Right. And that's another monopoly, right? Where you would think there was this crazy licensing ecosystem that existed for copyrighted works by composers all over the world. No. I've known some of these people. What they do is you have a proprietary system that's installed in a chain of hotels around the world, and there's one composer, and it's usually the person who started the company, and they make royalties all the time from every hotel. Do you know what I'm saying? So the point is, this AI question will force us. And we can have all these kind of romantic myths about how things work, how effective copyright is. It will force us to contend with the brass tacks, with the bare truth of it. And the truth of it is that actually this 20th century culture industry has been on its last legs for 20 years. It's been under threat from UGC, user-generated content, the streaming industry, so on and so forth. It's running on fumes in some cases. Hollywood running on fumes in some cases. And we just can't ignore it. And so if you view it like that, I actually think that there's a great many opportunities with these models, right? Case in point, in the filmmaker world, I'm a lover of film. I've always wanted to make a film. And I'm like, wait, so in order to make a crazy film now, you wouldn't have to go through, a production company that has completely different incentives. We know that the standard of film has dropped horribly over the last few decades. What you could just, with a small team of people, use these tools to make something that actually meant something. That sounds amazing. Like, why are we lamenting this or talking about it as being a threat to creativity? Like, of course, you're going to get a lot more crap. It's just a parallel thing, right? Like you said, you can generate infinite crap. Sure, you could do that, but who cares? We're going to have filters. AI is the remedy to that too. We're going to have our own kind of filters to be able to sift through that, because otherwise it's completely untenable. The most important thing is, how do you put tools or opportunities in the hands of people or communities of people who have something that they want to make? And I think that, to that end, models are incredibly powerful and very cool. And so I'd rather get excited about art making than overly hung up on the negative stuff. But unfortunately, the negative stuff, as I said, we live in an attention economy. Try being the reasonable one on Twitter, right? It doesn't get you very far. Right? It's like nobody wants to fight about a relatively reasonable argument that everyone could just agree with, right? That's not fun. That's not.
Yeah, we don't want a pragmatic, realistic.
No. Like, who wants that? And but over time, as I said, in 30 years' time, I think a lot of that stuff will end up seeming silly. The most important thing is being like, it is important to find ways to sustain artists. It is important to, and if you're going to do that and your starting premise is being in denial about what's happening with machine learning, you're not helping them. You're just giving them poetry to make them feel good temporarily, and I found this a lot where, in some odd cases, it's like people, I've been definitely kind of it appears I've crossed some picket lines or whatever that I never, invisible picket lines I never signed up for. But simply the fact that I won't lie to creative people, I can't do it. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not fair to them to underestimate what's about to happen. That's not fair. That's not, people. The most fair and honest thing to do is, give it to me straight, Doc. Right? But that's the.
You sort of, sometimes people need the wake up call, right? If they're sort of hung up on nostalgia of the way things were, then the good, honest thing to do, it might hurt more, it may be more painful, but if you go through it and you're like, these are the reasons why this is coming, prepare yourself for it, and it'll be better. Totally. And then they have to go through the trough. I guess people just don't want to go through the trough of despair.
Totally. Well, but as I say, but it's in their best interest to do so and come out of it realizing that, again, the thing that they probably most value about art and music and so on and so forth has very little to do with copyright. I mean, come on, like it's it's all these intangible things that will end up being more valuable over time. Like I was in a club recently. I don't go to clubs very often anymore, but with a German economist, and it was like a post gallery thing, and there was a club, there's people performing, and I think he's going through his own trough of despair about the kind of the economic fallout of these models. He's like, and I was like, okay, I'm going to try and communicate to you my optimism here. And I should also qualify, my definition of optimism is you have to go through the trough of despair to qualify as an optimist. Because otherwise you're just like a dreamer, like I'm not a dreamer, right? Like if you haven't factored all the ways it's most likely going to go wrong, or I think all the bad things are going to happen. Like I think all the industries are going to be shaken up, and I don't think by the end of it will be that bad, right? But anyway, so I was sitting there and I was like, okay, we're old enough now. I turned 40. So I was like, I remember getting the internet when I was 14 and I was obsessed. Can you imagine going back and talking to your mother and father about the different value interactions that are happening in this club in 2025? How would you explain it to them, right? And you'd be like, you can explain it because you got people on their phones. There's like a pop star DJing, doing whatever, and they're on their phone. And you're like, the subtle kind of economics and all this stuff that's happening in this room right now, you would be able to translate that to someone in 1996 or whatever. You would, but it would come with all these caveats, right? Where you'd be like, hey, you know how, this is talking about the 90s, you know how like on occasion a Japanese watch company would like fly Bruce Willis to wear the watch and put it on a billboard in Shibuya? So it turns out he was an influencer, right? And it turns out that kind of association would end up being really important because of X, Y, and you would find all these things that, recommendations, right? So recommendations used to be the domain of like a record store. So it was like, okay, so when you go into Blockbuster, there's this little section which has the note written by the guy with the beard who like really loves exactly. It turns out that's going to be bigger than any of the stuff, and we're going so you have to identify all these things that in the 90s seemed valuable but like weren't that big a deal. But then over the last 20 years we've learned that's the sort of value. And so I was like, okay, so all you have to do now, and again, open season for people to speculate on this, is look at the latent valuable things currently, that knowing how these tools work, what's going to be the valuable thing in 20 years, that's going to be really obvious. Fingers crossed we're both here in 20 years time to reflect on this, but like in 20 years time, we'll be like, oh, turns out that thing that I always thought was really valuable about this person's Twitter account, now they're president or whatever, but just like, that's the next economy, and all this stuff we're worried about of, like there being no jobs anymore or whatever. I mean, maybe there weren't many jobs, maybe that'd be good. I don't know. But like it will seem obvious in retrospect, but that's the difficult work, right? The difficult work is being like, what are the dynamics that we actually do all value, but they aren't concretized, and they certainly aren't, we haven't structured things around this. And I think I hope he left it a bit more optimistic, because I think there are latently valuable things that we all engage in right now that don't lose their power, irrespective of having these remarkable machines. Models.
I like that example because you're sort of illustrating how something existed in the 90s, but it sort of morphed in a way that maybe it would have been difficult to predict. And in the same way, it's very difficult to predict where, this AI thing will go. But there's going to be some underlying things that, for example, human connection that you talked about earlier, that like we do value irregardless of the tools or the technology of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, totally. And there's there's always latency, right, between kind of like public discourse on this stuff and like dev discourse, right? So like I can say one thing I think is really interesting that's happening in the field right now. So co-founder Jordan, who's a very, very, very talented machine learning developer. He's using Cursor. So Cursor, if people aren't familiar, the code helper. And it's like you can talk to it. So this interface I'm looking on a screen right now feels temporal. I mean, it feels like something you would do every now and then. But the fact that we spend all our lives on screens feels utterly kind of arbitrary when we can just talk to these things. So you're like, okay, there's all this development going into small devices, wearable things that you can wear, that would allow you to ostensibly have a very productive workday without sitting down. I mean, I've gotten more into this just intuitively. I'm like, wait, what? I mean, honestly, if it weren't for the fact that we needed a nicer microphone right now, I'd often take my calls walking. And I'm like, wow. So oddly, with this is kind of a beautiful idea. Like these models could actually help us to live more social lives, right? Like more rich lives out in places in the world, out gardening or walking or attending things, while still maintaining a level of productivity that we wanted to, or more productivity perhaps than we have right now, hurting our backs sitting in front of this screen. Like, okay, so how do social spaces change there? How do public spaces change there? How do like, is the concert something you attend daily because there's a desire for music everywhere? You can just extrapolate from these very simple points and be like, that actually sounds more feasible to me as just spitballing than the standard negative thing is being like, oh, the future is going to be everyone doom scrolling with bots distracting your attention. I'm like, no, the opposite. I think that we're actually going to gain our attention back from this. That's the beauty of these models. That if anything, that's where this has to go. I think OpenAI is an existential threat to Twitter, honestly. And you know what I mean? So
it makes me think about, I can't remember who said it, but somebody was talking about how like it's quite easy to write a dystopian novel or film or something like that, because I think our brains, are just trained to spot danger, and it's quite easy to think about the ways that things could go wrong.
Yeah.
But it's actually more difficult to come up with utopian or at least positive, optimistic outlooks for the future.
Absolutely. And that's why I think you need to earn your optimism, because it's difficult. I mean, I'm a manic depressive. I can give you all the bad scenarios. Like that's easy, right? That's like it's often the fastest way to sound really smart, right? Is you're like, oh, and it's like, no, that's the low hanging fruit. The difficult part is, let's just factor all those threats exist.
Yeah.
How do you overcome them, right? I mean, you could say the same about climate, etc. Like you can doom all day. I mean, I can think of a gajillion different scenarios, and you're like, well, if it's kind of happening, then what are we going to do about it? That one's really tough. People go really quiet on that part. It sounds like solutionism or whatever. It's like no. Like it's like no, that we kind of need people to be doing that stuff. That's So I mean, I think that's really where the art is. Honestly, that's where the important discussions are. Is you can't just be a doomer about things. But I mean, but I think that there's a lot to look forward to. But you do just have to swallow that it's not going to look like 2003 or whatever era it was that you have a very strong attachment to. But you will see traces of that persist, because there are just traces to cultural life and to art and to thought that are just Lindy in that way, and they've been Lindy long before we started putting songs on wax or whatever kind of temporal thing, and so so if anything, I'm happy, because being a kind of Web 2 skeptic, I think a lot of those chickens are going to come to roost. I think that a lot of the again, a lot of the kind of the weaknesses of the attention economy logic and so on and so forth are really going to be exposed. And great, we get a bit of a redo. Still bad things will happen. I mean, I don't, I lose faith very regularly, but we get a redo. That the point is, you just have to, you need skin in the game, right? You need to be in the game to have some kind of positive influence on that. Otherwise, it's just moaning, which is cathartic and can get some people temporarily very far, but I think is not good for anybody.
Yeah. Well, it's been absolutely incredible talking with you, Matt. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. Maybe just to kind of wrap up and end on, I would love to hear, are there any things, can you give us a hint of sort of what you're exploring or working on next? Is there kind of any other exhibitions in the works? Or I think you mentioned a book.
Yeah, thanks. It's been lovely. It's nice to catch up. We have a bunch on. I mean, on the spawning side, we're still training public diffusion, so that we plan to have that out this year. It's been a slog, but it will get there. Holly and I have an exhibition. All the stuff we have coming up, we can't announce, but basically we have exhibitions for the next couple of years. So we're really in that world now, which is great. It's a whole new challenge, but that's really fun. So I mean, we're also curating a show. I can't say where, but we're curating a big show next year too, which will likely have something to do with the book that I mentioned. I don't know. I mean, thematically, I guess, we can't escape this AI thing. I mean, if anything, if I'm absolutely honest with you, there is a part of me that's sick to death of it. Just at the time where
you've been living it since 2018, 2019.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing. So
when you're playing around with
that's the thing.
TensorFlow.
That's the thing. So it's this always happens where I'm like, oh God, but I mean, it continues to be enriching and intellectually stimulating, but I'm definitely like, oh God, it would be really nice to think about something else for a minute. But I guess that's just getting older. So it's, we have a lot coming up, but we're really very happy to be in this kind of exhibition land for the time being, because it's, I mean, we do miss music terribly. It was kind of stolen away from us with COVID, if I'm honest. I mean, we haven't really played a big show. We headlined a festival in Amsterdam the night before lockdown. Wow. And it turns out that was when we stopped doing big festivals. So I mean, I'm sure at some point in future we'll release another record, but with good fortune, this is kind of the opportunity now is to make big exhibitions, and so there's going to be a lot coming on that front.
Sweet. And in case anybody wanted to follow along, I know you're Mat Dryhurst on Twitter, or sorry, X, also on Instagram. Where else should people go to kind of keep up with what you're doing?
Basically that. I mean, both Holly and I are terrible about posting anything. So I use Twitter as like a scrap pad for occasional thoughts that I should probably formulate into articles. There's a benefit to AI models is, finding ways to produce long pieces of writing by people who don't have the time to produce long pieces of writing. That'll be a thing. But Twitter, it's the same on Instagram. I just barely post, but if anyone has a question or a thought, I normally respond. So yep.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, once again, thank you for joining. I would love to do this again sometime. And we'll see you in the future.
Very happy to. Thank you so much, Nico.